The week one recording for Management 6051, Managing and Leading. And in our introductory session for the first week, we talked about the nature managerial work and then also some of the historical background, which gives us some insight into how people have thought about over time the nature of management and leadership, which gives us some insight into why we think some of the things that we think today, partly because people have tried some very common sense approaches to leading and managing organizations, and understanding why those particular approaches proved ineffective is helpful for us to understand some of the perspective we have on organizations today. So the approach in this course is a behavioral analysis approach. And by behavioral analysis, what we mean is we don't prejudge behavior. We don't start with how people should or should not behave. What we do instead is start and try to understand what are the behaviors we see in a situation, and we try to understand why individuals behave as they do. And for us, the entry point on this was Mintzberg's research on managerial work. Rather than judging what people are doing relative to a model of kind of should that he uses as the contrast, he really tries to postpone judgment and understand what are the situations that impact how people behave in the situation of a managerial job. And it led him to really have an appreciation for the time constraints and the demands that managers face in doing their job, and led to a different explanation of managerial work. And it's an explanation that'll be threaded throughout the topics that we talk about throughout the course. So we're going to revisit, for instance, this preference for interpersonal direct communication when we start about talking about organizational information systems, start to understand how that impacts decision making in organization. Another key part of the kind of introduction and understanding of managerial work is to understand that a lot of what people are doing is working with peers and superiors. And so the people problems we have in the workplace are not just motivating employees. We're also trying to motivate action of peers and who are in different departments whose collaboration we may need, and also to persuade and motivate action on the part of superiors whose support we need for various kinds of initiative. So as we move through the course, we will, yes, of course, we'll start talking about topics of rewarding employees and managing individual behavior. But that, just as important for us in the course, is how do we impact the behavior of peers and superiors, because being effective as a leader in an organization involves having influence in all directions. We also talked about that, in many of the topic areas in the business school, we do have a normative perspective that we pursue in those topics. They come up with good techniques, good things that we can do to make a difference in the organization. But, where the organizational behavior stuff comes is on the implementation side. So we have something we would like to do, and the effectiveness of the implementation of it is where leadership comes in. And this is very much aligned with the perspective you saw in the Cotter reading about our capacity to lead and implement change as a key facet of our leadership effectiveness. And there are a variety of things that we're dealing with. We're dealing with vested interest in the status quo, resistance to change. We need to understand those as features of the organization. And so your leadership skills are not simply general skills, but very often are necessary to implement things that are related to your functional responsibilities you have in the organization. For our purpose and in kind of understanding managing and leading, the differentiation we're going to use is management is the role that you occupy, and leadership is your conduct in that role. And though people can have authority that comes with their management positions, that doesn't make them leaders. Leadership is something people learn how how to use their authority effectively to make a difference in the organization. We went ahead in the intro session and talked about some of the the historical background of leadership. And one of the very key things that happened in the history of business thought was the development of scientific management. And we reviewed and talked a little bit about what happened during the period of industrialization in the US, where there's these enormous changes in the business environment that fundamentally changed the nature of firms, and then and doing so changed the nature of the leadership problem. So we talked about the expansion of the railroads, which opened up broad markets so that the best and most efficient producer could reach many different markets that wasn't no longer localized. The kind of spread of electrification, which allowed the rationalization of production systems and was a major force in helping lower costs and make enterprises more efficient. And in both of these things together, one of the impacts they had was enormous expansion of the size of enterprises. We went from a typical enterprise of 12 or 15 people to enterprises that had tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of people in a single enterprise. The nature of the leadership and management problems, vastly changed as the enterprises scaled up in size. And what we saw was management methods. The one we talked about was the drive system that had been kind of the historic approach to management, utterly and totally failed. And doing things more effectively involved we really start to think about the organization of the social system in a different way. We talked about Frederick Taylor's scientific management, and in scientific management, Taylor put a real big emphasis on the kind of the design of the production process, the procedures for doing production. It was and he had a very systematic approach to studying how work was done, how it could best be done, and so his version of organization design is the organization of the production system, and his management theory was to use piece rate compensation to reward people for productivity. And as we talked about it, there were a number of things that were hard to manage with this. One of the biggest things that was tough to manage was the allocation from capital investments. We, as the capitalists, made the investments. We thought we should get all the return. The employees are experiencing productivity increases as more work for them to do, more fatigue on their jobs, perhaps making their jobs less skilled. And then how do we allocate that? And there were many issues that came up in response to scientific management, and led it to be, come to be regarded as not the best way, right? It has, and it is the root of production management, many kind of disciplines that are in business today. Cost accounting has its roots in scientific management. But from a leadership standpoint, its emphasis on the people as the cogs in the machine, and you grease them with the compensation system, that really failed to appreciate the kind of nuances of what are going on in the social system, how people collaborate, how workplace norms govern production systems. And the difficulty with scientific management is it didn't have in its assumption set a way to even ask those questions of what's going on in organization. We talked about this pivotal experiment that had a huge impact on how we think about organization, the Hawthorne experiments, which were the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric. And in those experiments, what people came to realize was that there was something they called the informal organization. And the way that the organization operates and its productivity is very much influenced by informal leaders in the workplace, the informal social norms that people adopt that govern productivity. And that realization that was existing was kind of stunning to people, right? Is this kind of notion that management actually does not control the workplace was, really upsetting, and people really tried to figure out what to do about it. And in fact, their response was, well, how can we capture the informal system? So we try to train supervisors in group techniques, and they learn to kind of take over groups, and it just proved ineffective. It also got supervisors involved in aspects of the social organization that just simply weren't productive venues for them spending their time. So the bowling league and stuff like that. So it partly just failed because it too had a very incomplete understanding of the social system. It focused very much on this informal structure, but really trying to capture it and take it away, and it just wasn't available for capture. Out of these kind of traditions of the very engineering-oriented approach to scientific management, and the modern manifestation of scientific management is industrial engineering, where they put an emphasis on time and motion studies and development of workplace methods. These days it has a very large component of automation in it. Is one line of descent from scientific management. And then what would be, and often is maybe unfairly thought of as the kind of touchy-feely approaches of what was called human relations management. What emerged out of both of those trends is a modern field called organizational behavior. It is the training of people who are in our management department, and it is a application of social science findings to management and leadership, and in particular things that we're going to study, like how do we get people committed to an organization, how do organizational cultures work, how do we align interests, how do we basically make peace with the informal organization, and come to a place where leadership can be very effective, and we can have good value generation. So this is kind of the things we're going to talk about in the course. So we've had a prelude to that, and that's the direction that we're going to go. On the further readings, which I have managed to leave off the bottom of the page by the way I structured this window, but let me go over these anyway. You can see them on your handout. First is the Henry Mintzberg, The Nature of Managerial Work, which is the book-length treatment of the HBR article you read. Has a great deal more detail. I don't think it tells us much more. A real classic of business history is Alfred Chandler's The Visible Hand. And The Visible Hand is a book about the emergence of middle management, and how middle management came to develop innovations like cost accounting, like various kind of production system, and how that fundamentally altered the nature of enterprises, making them more efficient. And so the notion of the visible hand is the play off the invisible hand of the market. So making them more efficient, making them work better. And so it's a brick of a book. It's a big, long book, but if you are genuinely interested in business history, it is the book to read. And Chandler was a Harvard historian who specialized in business. I also have down Daniel Nelson, Managers and Workers, which is a book that has quite a bit on factory architecture, which is pretty fascinating. The kind of the cleverness of people in the early industrial period, and how they designed their plants, how they used gravity feed, how they used water power, and the kind of factory architecture that resulted when we had no natural light, but you were working often still 24-hour shifts, and so lighting systems and stuff like that. I mean, it's in some ways very mundane, but Nelson manages to make it quite interesting. And then I also have down there a novel, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and that was Upton Sinclair was one of the muckrakers, and he wrote a novel based on the reality of the meatpacking industry in particular. He had a lot of commentaries on food processing, and it was about the inhumane labor conditions that were present in big factories in the early industrial period. And had enormous impact, partly because, as Upton Sinclair said himself, I aimed for America's heart and I hit him in the stomach. Because when people read about the unsanitary conditions and the way that their food was handled, they literally made them sick. And out of this came a lot of our food and drug regulation, a lot of things about Pure Food Act and things like that actually came out of his effort to solicit from America sympathy for the workforce. And what he got was, I'm really worried about what is on my dinner table. So a significant book, and is considered kind of significant in the history of the documentation of labor during this period. In general, on these further readings, I like to kind of introduce you to some things that may be of interest, and realizing that you don't have time now, and you may never have time. But I can say that of all the things I'm going to talk about over the next 10 weeks, the Alfred Chandler Visible Hand, if you got the time to kind of spend a week and really get yourself educated about the evolution of business and management, principally in the United States. He's looking globally, and there's some European stuff in here as well. It's well worth it. It is what I think an educated business leader, it's one of the must reads. With that, we'll see you next week, in which we'll be starting our material on individual behavior.